Hey folks, welcome to my presentation. Here we're going to be looking at this little scene that I put together here. The theme is the metaverse. You know, as I think about the metaverse, I start thinking, if we're going to make everything in the metaverse, then what's going to happen to like religion? And so I started thinking this like zany scene where like some kind of guru or saint or deity or whatever would come down with an avatar. So that's what we're going to be making. And throughout this, it's going to be very interesting. We're going to be looking at a mix of really cool things. We're going to be starting out in Mixamo, and we're going to be getting a character from Mixamo and bringing it into Cinema 4D. And there's a few little tricks and tips along the way that are very interesting that I'm going to pass along. I think they're interesting anyways. And we're not going to be doing like every single thing step by step, but I'm going to be showing you the challenges that I had and the things that kind of gave me pause and messed me up a little bit, and I'll be showing you how I overcame them. So like I said, we start in Mixamo, get the character, bring it over into Cinema 4D, we pose it, bring it over into After Effects using Cineware, and then we use the live link to connect Cinema and After Effects, so we have a live link, so when we fiddle with stuff in Cinema, it updates in After Effects. Next, we're going to be using Trapcode Form to create particles. Like the bottom base of him is kind of like these particles making him like this hologram type thing. And then we're going to disrupt those particles using audio, actually audio from a movie, Ninja Death 3, if you're interested. So that's kind of fun. And then we're going to make this code on the side. There's a great universe effect, if you're not familiar with it, that generates code, actual code on screen, which is a great lifesaver when you just kind of want to fill the screen with some kind of technical details like this. Then we're going to add a reflection here into this scene. And this is one of my favorite parts of this whole scene. I was initially going to be like, maybe I'll add a reflection, maybe I won't. It's like a dinky little throwaway thing. But I think I learned the most in this whole presentation preparation thing by some of the challenges that this particular reflection presented. So I'm really excited about that. And then finally, we're going to wrap it all together with Supercomp to composite all together and make it look like it belongs in the same world. If you're not familiar with Supercomp, I'll just briefly explain it, but when we get there. But it's a fun little thing to play with, especially if you're trying to do compositing in After Effects. So I started here in Mixamo, and I found this guy that looked like one of the Facebook style metaverse characters of the future, and I downloaded him. And I couldn't find a pose that really felt like a deity to me, so I was like, I'm gonna have to go into Cinema and do this myself. So I'm gonna show you how I did that. I clicked on download, and since I couldn't find a pose that worked for me already, I changed the pose here to a T pose so that the character would be in this like T pose thing like this. So I got this, and then I opened this character up in Cinema. This is what that looked like, and I got some weirdness here. If I hit Control R, Command R on the PC or on the Mac to render this, we can see that some of these textures are looking kind of wonky. So what I had to do was go into let's say the eyes, for example, and the alpha channel doesn't carry over with these textures. So I clicked on the alpha channel, and then what I did is I went to color, texture here, drop down, and I copied this shader, went to the alpha, and pasted the shader, and then that got me better eyes. And I did that with each of the textures. You can see if I render this again, his eyes are fixed, but then we have some brow issues, and we also have some lip issues. So I went through and I fixed those textures, and then I went through and posed them. You can see this bone structure here. And to be totally honest, I am not used to the bone structure in Cinema or any program, actually. So I didn't know what I was doing. And so what I wanted to do was isolate just the bones. So I went to not the selection thing here, but the selection filter below this. And then I chose none to clear out the all of the other selection things. And then I went back to selection filter and then choose just joint here. And now I can only select the bones. So I'll click on one of these bones then, and you can see I have it here. And then I could like move these points like so. And I could also like hit R to get the rotation tool and rotate this and kind of pose this, this figure how I want it. So this is what I ended up doing for the character. This is the way that I ended up posing him in the end here. It's kind of like a guru style. you know, bent those legs and kind of something yoga-ish like so. And then I saved this for Cineware. You go to File and then Save Project for Cineware. That way After Effects can recognize it. So I went into After Effects here. Now, because this file's already done here, it's not going to be a great example. So I'm going to actually use this character that I just barely did anything to at all. We'll just say that guy. Oh my goodness, what am I doing? Okay, so there's that guy. He's doing some interesting stuff there. And I'll go ahead and save him like this. And then I'll go to After Effects and double click to import this file. Now, if I add this to my comp here with the background already done, and I've also done the camera tracking on this. If we look, I applied the 3D camera tracker. I also did some levels and curvesing. So there's some levels, and there's my original plate there. Levels, curves, 3D camera trackers. We tracked that information and put it into this tracker camera here. And then if we have our 3D object, our Cineware file here, then we can see our object, our 3D object here in this scene. The renderer is not super great by default. The viewport draft, we're seeing the grids here, which could be good for placement and stuff, but I don't want that now. I'm just going to choose current, which is going to give me some better quality here. But you know, the placement is off still. And I want this camera, I want this object to be using not the Cinema 4D camera, but my comp camera. But when I do that, it completely disappears. And this camera is really important in my After Effects comp because I tracked the camera in this scene. So I really need that Cinema 4D file to show up exactly here where this camera can see it. The AE comp can see it. So there's this amazing feature that I love here in Cineware. Down at the bottom, I can choose the comp camera into Cinema 4D. I can merge that with the click of a button. And it says the After Effects camera was merged into the Cinema 4D project. I go back to Cinema, and look at that. We have a nifty, handy-dandy AE 3D tracker camera. And as we look through that, we can see that we are really far off. But as we click this little white icon here to not look through that, we can see that our guy is like nowhere near the After Effects camera, which is over here. So what I can do is then select all this content here, and then hit E for the move tool, move this guy into place so that we can see him in the right spot. Now, the first few times, when I was first doing this, you know, it got pretty annoying trying to get this guru kid in the right spot, and then go back into After Effects and see how it worked, reload it, and keep going back and forth like that. But there's a great feature called Live Link. And what I could do is in Cinema, I can go to Edit, Preferences, and then under Extensions, go to After Effects on the left-hand side here and choose Live Link Enabled at Startup. And then I'll need to restart Cinema. But then what happens when I bring in stuff from Cinema into After Effects through Cineware, when I save the project in Cinema, that's important. You can't just it's not dynamic link where you just make a change and then it shows automatically. You have to save it in Cinema, then it shows up automatically in After Effects. So let's try that here. I'm going to save that and then go back into After Effects. And now I could see that my little guru guy with his weird pose there shows up in After Effects. So I make the change in Cinema, save it, and it shows up here in After Effects, which is really great when you're trying to do things like this, like place it and whatnot, because you really don't have control over transform and things like that when you're here in After Effects without a little bit of fiddling. So I could go to the transform, like if I went to S for scale, you could see that we have an expression here. I can't adjust that this way. So if I wanted to do basic transforms on a Cinema 4D object in After Effects, I would need to use the transform effect. So keep that in mind. I can still do all the basic transforms, just need to use the transform effect. But anyway, so here we are. We got our guy, and now the 3D file, the Cinema 4D file, is responding to the camera tracker data that we tracked here in After Effects and then sent over to Cinema 4D. Now, this is where it gets exciting. Everything we've done so far, I mean, it's kind of cool and it's good to know, but it's not like fun, you know, it's not like real fun. But now we're going to get the fun stuff because we've done all of the setup stuff. So we're going to go to Trapcode Form and start making particles, which, I mean, Who doesn't like particles, right? I mean, particles are amazing. So what we're going to do here is I have this C4D file imported already, and I got the right one, you know, with the pose and stuff like that. I also went through and added a little bit of curves and a little bit of Gaussian blur just to make this kid kind of fit in this world a little bit better. I'm a little heavy-handed on that curves, it looks like, but whatever, it's fine. And then what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and press Control Y on the PC, Command Y on the Mac to make a new comp. I'm going to call it Form, and I'm going to click Make Comp Size. So I'm just making a solid comp size. Just no tricks up my sleeve, standard thing. And then now I'm going to apply Trapcode Form. Now this is where it gets, again, pretty fun, because what we're going to do is we're going to make a 3D particle representation of our Cinema 4D Guru character. So what I can do is go into the base form, and, you know, and for those of you who aren't familiar, Trapcode Form is an unusual particle system because it takes particles, and instead of emitting them and shooting them out all the time, the particles just like live there. They just like exist. They're not born, they don't die, they just kind of stay there. And then you kind of arrange them into forms, or, you know, whatever you're doing with them. There's just all kinds of stuff, as we'll see, that you can do with them. And so one of the things here is in base form, I can change the arrangement of these particles to a 3D model. And that opens up the 3D model settings down here. Open this up, and from this drop down, I could actually choose the Cinema 4D file. So for a long time, Form has been able to use OBJ files, and now fairly recently, we can use Cinema 4D files, even animated Cinema 4D files, as the shape that Form is going to turn into particles. So I'm going to choose the Cinema 4D layer right from our timeline. I'm like, boom, there's our character, you know? So I'm going to go ahead and I don't think you need to choose effects and masks to use the Cineware effect. Yeah, you don't. You don't have to. You just leave it set to source, which is kind of an interesting thing. You can also choose whether the particles in Form are applied to the edges, as they are by default here, or to vertices, or to faces, or to the volume, the stuff all inside of the mesh, essentially. And it's actually what we want here, but it's just obviously a little bit too dense. So I'm going to take the particle density down to 65%. And we're starting to see a little bit here, but we'll leave it there. That's the right settings. We're going to fiddle with it more, and it's going to look better than that. It's also a little bit too big here. So the base form size, I'm going to change to 345. You can also then adjust the Y position to put this in place here. And I'm not going to take too much time getting that perfect just now, but I'm going to close up base form, open up particle. Let's randomize the size of these particles. Let's say 20% randomness. I'm also going to take the color down to a red color here. And you might think, oh, well, this is the color that I want, but I'm actually going to take a really muddy red, a desaturated dark red, and click OK. And the reason I'm doing that, I'll just zoom in here. The reason I'm doing that is because I want to take advantage of the add blend mode. So in the blend mode, I'm going to change this to add so that those particles kind of like add on top of each other, and we get more of like a hologrammy look. Now this is too orderly. I mean, it's very obviously a grid, and we don't want that look. So we're going to fiddle with that in just a moment. But first I want to change this so that there's the top half of the guru is only the guru, and then the bottom half is like we're seeing like, you know, behind the matrix, and we're seeing the hologram that this guy actually is. So what I want to do is adjust the opacity of the particles along the Y axis so that there's no form particles up on the top, but there is form particles on the bottom. So what I can do is go to the opacity over area here, change this to opacity over Y, and then I'm going to open up the opacity curve. And so then I can draw in a curve that represents how I want this to be seen. So the left side of this graph represents the top of the form particles here. The right side represents the bottom. So the top I want to be just completely transparent. So I'm just going to like drag this down to kind of reduce the opacity, and then just kind of give it a nice little swipe up there. And I'll click smooth a few times, lots of times, kind of smooth that out. Maybe like add in some more detail here, just like click and drag as needed. Oop, not like that. There we go. Flatten a little bit, smooth, smooth, smooth. And then sometimes it's like hard to like draw that perfectly. I don't know. It's like a tiny little thing. Maybe it's because I'm using like a high DPI monitor or something like that. But what I do is I switch over to the pen tool here. And then sometimes I'll have one of these points that's like up really high. And it's kind of easier to manipulate them once you have kind of a basic starting point here. So I can kind of smooth that out as I want. And we're still getting a little bit of detail here that I don't want. So I'm going to adjust the size of the particles in the same way. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this whole graph, go over to size, change the size over Y, and then do the same thing where I open up the size curve. And instead of drawing it, I can just click paste to paste the copied graph. So now we're having those particles shrink as well. So it's starting to look like a little something here, just a little bit. Now, I mentioned that these particles are too uniform, so let's fiddle with that. I'm going to close up particle, open up Fractal Field, and there's this invisible fractal noise behind the scenes here, and that fractal noise we can use that to affect the particles in different ways. So, for example, we could affect the size. I'm going to take the size to 3. So then we affect the size a little bit. So you see some of these particles get smaller, some of these get bigger based on where the fractal is and what it's doing. Also do that with opacity, increase that effect. I'm going to take this to 20. And we could also use this fractal field to displace the particles. So I'm going to change this to 6 there. So just a little bit of warble. But the thing is, the fractal map is too big. We're getting really huge chunks of white and huge chunks of black because you can see in the particles that big chunks of them are changing at once. And we want it to be a little bit more subtle and fine throughout. So what we got to do is go down to the fractal field settings down here and kind of fine tune those. For example, if I take the gamma up to 1.2, you can see that affects the gamma of the underlying fractal field. And the F scale is the parameter here that I use most often. I think I'm only going to bump this up to 15. But even when we do that, you could see, if we bump this up to, like, let's say 50, like really high, you could see that it's a much smaller pattern. So we get much smaller changes close together rather than big chunks of lack of opacity or changing opacity or whatever we're doing. So I'm going to take F scale down to back down to 15 because that's what works. So it's in my notes. And I'm going to go ahead and go back up to base form and just, before I add more particles here, I'm going to add more particles in just a second, but I'm going to get this, and it's bothering me now. That's not like in the exact right spot. So it overlays our guy there. There we go. That looks better. And now what I'm going to do is I want to duplicate this form and fiddle with the duplicate. And so I can go into show forms and add whole new layers of form on top of itself. But the most intelligent way to do that is in the designer. Actually, the only way to do that is in the designer. But I'm going to go ahead and click on designer to open up the designer. This is a very visual way to kind of see what's going on with your form particles. I'm going to go ahead and pause that, and I'm going to go to the form on the left-hand side here in this drop-down. I'm going to duplicate this form so we have a second copy here. Now, because of the camera in the scene, our object is kind of way over here, and we're not entirely seeing it. We could go in here to the camera tool, which is one of the best things about the designer. I could use this little temporary camera tool, and I can orbit around my object. I could pan, I could zoom, and do all this kind of stuff, but it's only temporary. As soon as I click apply, I can, I go back to my regular After Effects, and nothing has really changed. It's just a temporary change, so you can kind of look around your object and pan around it and stuff like that, which is really cool. So I'm just going to go ahead and click apply. Now I'm going to make sure that form 2 is selected so we could adjust form 2. I'm going to leave a lot of this stuff the same. I'm going to open up the 3D model settings, but instead of filling the volume with these particles, I'm just going to use the edges. So I'm going to say particles from edges. I'll go ahead and bump this up to 85. We're not seeing too much of a difference just yet. So what I'm going to do is go over to the color, and I'm going to make this a very faint light blue here. And now you're starting to see that difference. Probably see it a little bit too much, a little bit too much here. So let's go to the particle settings here, and I'm going to change the particle size down to 1 so it's thinner. That's a little bit more elegant. I like that. I'm also going to take the opacity down to 20. So again, we just have these faint little lines over this. I love the way that looks. Now, because we duplicated the first form, we still have the same opacity curve and size curve. So if you're an astute observer here, you might have noticed that we still have some stuff in the northern half of our guru here. We have particles back there. So what's the deal? The situation is that when you start adding the fractal field, it can override what you've done in the other graphs. So the fractal field can still put opacity where there wasn't opacity, and so forth. But watch this. I'm going to go ahead and select one of these curves. I'll just go ahead and copy the curve again. I'm going to go down to the fractal field, close these up here. So go down to the fractal field. You can see there's also a fractal strength over. So I can change the fractal strength over Y as well. Go to the curve, click paste. And now the fractal field is only affecting the particles in this area as well. And so then it doesn't have permission to bring those other particles on the top of the guru back into opacity. Now, just as an FYI, I also fiddled with the fractal field a little bit. I took the flow evolution down a bit, like maybe to like even 12, just like really, really slow, so that it's a different speed than the red particles. Actually, let's preview that so we can see what we have going on here. Because we use the fractal field, we will see, you know, these particles kind of moving around. We have them, the field affecting their size or opacity, and it's a slow undulating thing, and intentionally so. So from frame to frame, there's not that big of a difference. But as I load this in and then preview this, you can see that we're getting these particles kind of moving around there. I like that. Another thing is I wanted these kind of like white wireframe particles that we have on the edges here to kind of like cycle upwards through our character. So I added some negative Y flow. So let's say like negative 20 or something like that. And that adds almost like a wind that goes from the bottom to the top. Let's preview that and see what it looks like. So it's very subtle, but we slowly have these particles kind of creeping up a little bit as well. These like white wireframe particles moving up on the y-axis. Now, there is a third form that I added. I just kind of like use vertices, and then I spread them out a little bit bigger than the other ones. So it's just kind of like this like fairy dust looking thing here. But it's not super thrilling, so I'm not going to go over it, just basic particle stuff. It kind of looks like particular. Oh, and speaking of particular, if you're new to this, if you haven't been paying attention to the updates lately that have been going on in the world of Red Giant, Trapcode Particular now has form built into it. So you can generate form particles like this as well. I didn't use that here, but just be aware that that does exist. Now, you might be saying, well, if it's there, then why didn't you just use Particular? And this here is one of the reasons I didn't use Particular, because one of the best features of form, one of the most underappreciated and fun things to play with, is that form can use audio to control particle reactions. So I'm going to take this clip here, which is this clip from Ninja Death 3, a public domain old martial arts movie. Let's look at that. So just this dude going crazy on a drum, as one does, you know. And so what we're going to do is we don't have to hear this. We don't have to see it. We don't have to, like, you know, no one in our audience has to know that we're using clips of Ninja Death 3. You could use a clip of like Taylor Swift and Rolling Stones playing for Disney or something. And if you're just using it to control particles, no one knows what's going on. So this like little beat is going to be great, because what I want to have happen is I want there to start to be like ripples, like the matrix is kind of like falling apart, like we're getting some kind of signal interruption in the flow of our particles here. So I have our particles all set up for us. Also, another thing that I did is I went and made masks in this composition. So I masked the top half of the guru, and I masked the bottom half of the form particles, so that you know, it kind of disappears. You know, like a little bit of particles on his hands, and a little bit of him in the bottom, but it's just kind of like this cool transition where it's like the particles are forming him essentially. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start on Form 2. That's the white wireframe particles. I'm going to click on Form 2, and I'm going to go to the Audio React section. And here we can choose the audio layer to cause a reaction with our particles. So I'm going to choose the drum 01, which is the video clip, and it's just going to use the audio from it. And now here's the part that throws people off sometimes. What we need to do is choose a source, like where the audio is coming from. And we also need to choose what property is going to be controlled by the audio. So in this case, I actually want to change this to displace Z, for example. So that's going to move the particles in Z space, like towards us. Now, again, you might not notice anything here as we preview this. And that can be for a lot of reasons. Number one, we have to make sure that the audio actually has something going on during the times that we're previewing. And I can tell you right now that that's fine. The strength thing here, the strength value is at 0 right now. So let's bump that up to like 350. And now let's preview this again. By the way, this actually does take a minute to render on my screen, but I'm speeding up that process of like loading the frames into RAM just so you're not sitting here like totally bored and stuff. So now with the strength at 350, you can see that we're getting this rhythmic pulsating displacement along the Z-axis. Now, as I mentioned, I kind of want to make it look like the signal is getting weak or there's like a glitch later on. I don't want it to start right away. So what I can do is just go to the time offset and say like, I don't know, 3 seconds. And so now that animation will wait for 3 seconds and then it will be triggered by the drum clip as if it started at the 3 second mark, which is really cool. Now, this animation is cool, but we could make it a lot better because by default, when you apply one of these reactors, it applies to the entire thing at once, the entire object. So the entire object is being displaced on the Z-axis. But if we use a delay, then let's say, for example, 1 second, then what happens is the default delay direction, as you can see here, is from on the x-axis, left to right. So when you say the delay max, when you set it to a non-zero number, this kicks in. So if I set it to 1 second, for example, it says that instead of displacing the entire thing at once along the z-axis, that starts from left to right, and over 1 second, it displaces the whole object from left to right. So let's preview that and watch this staggered delay of the displacement along the z-axis from left to right over a second. So here's 3 seconds of nothing, and then at 3 seconds, there's our ripple. So it's displacing along the z-axis, but the staggering is happening from left to right over 1 second. Instead of all at once, it's from left to right. So already, just with this one property, the displacement along the z-axis, we're seeing how much power that we can have over particles with audio. I mean, this is such an original and interesting and fun thing to play with. It's incredible. So just very quickly, what I did also, just to look at the final result here, now that we know what's going on. So you can see that I added these audio reaction to all these different particles. So they are displacing along the z-axis. There's a little bit of an opacity punch to bring up the opacity when the audio hits as well. So the audio is controlling all of these things. Thank you, Ninja Death 3, by the way, for helping this animation come to life. But it's affecting the opacity. It's affecting the disbursement of the particles and the displacement along the z-axis on multiple particle systems. Isn't that amazing? I think that's amazing. Oh, one other thing. Some of these audio reactions can be a little bit tricky. So for example, if I wanted to disperse the particles, one of the things I often use audio reaction for is to disperse particles. But I can change this to 3 seconds, and I'll go to the 3 second mark so we can kind of see what's going on here. And I can take the strength up to like 350. I can take the delay up to 1 second, and it's still not showing any difference whatsoever. And that's because some of these properties, when you're mapping to them, they actually have to have some of that value already. And if I go down to disperse and twist, these particles don't have any disperse on them at all. So if I take disperse up to like 30, then it will allow me to disperse the particles with the audio reaction. That's fun stuff. I mean, as you could probably tell, I could talk about particles all day long. But let's move on to another unsung hero, and that's the screen text effect in the Universe Suite. I'm going to go ahead and create a new solid, but I'm not going to create this one at the comp size. I'm going to use a special size here. I'm going to make it 400 by 250, so a little small dinky baby thing here. And that's because when we use this effect, it's going to fill the entire solid. So it's a good idea to make the solid the size that you're about going to want. So I could go ahead and apply, it's called the screen text effect. Spoiler, that's what we're going to be adding, screen text. But what I'm going to do, instead of applying it here, I'm going to apply it by going to the window menu and then extensions, and I'm going to open up the RG Universe dashboard. If you're not familiar with Red Giant Universe, this is how I recommend you get familiar with it and also initially use it to apply the effects. Because even though these effects are all in the effects and presets panel, you could apply it there if you want to. This is going to give you the categories of Universe and then thumbnails of each of the effects. You can see what they do. And say, for example, the text effects. And so like, you know, sometimes like the text, like screen text, what does that even mean? It's not completely clear, or hacker text. So I can apply the effect by clicking this button, or I could click on the thumbnail and browse presets for the effect, which kind of gives me a sense of what that effect can do. And screen text is one of my favorite all-time effects because it automates a thing that just annoys me. It drives me crazy. Like if you're going to make code on screen, which happens like all the time, thanks Matrix, right? I mean, like we have to do this all the time now as motion graphic designers. And so you have to put code on the screen or whatever, but like, you know, we're smart enough as a society, I think, to tell when something's just like a bunch of blah, 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 gobbledygook and when something's actual code. And so this effect has actual code in a bunch of different languages and styles and stuff like that. And so I can click on one of these and I could say apply preset, and there isn't any effect or whatever, but it goes ahead and applies the effect and applies the preset for me. So now I have this code that's actual, like, genuine code that kind of like types itself out, which is like really cool. It's a great way to add complexity to kind of like, you know, user interface stuff, or, you know, like the metaverse things, like we're just make it seem like there's code in the background. It takes the pain out of stuff like that, and it looks legit. Look at it. And I can also, from this dashboard here, I can choose a preset here, and that will open the dashboard as well. You know, I don't want to spend much more time on this, but, you know, I can take the scroll rate down so it's like slows down a little bit. And maybe instead of starting at nothing, which it usually does, I can increase scroll offset so then we see a little bit of code initially on the screen. I may also want to go into text settings, make this a little bit more fine detailed, like 8. And so we're just getting a little bit of code there. I can adjust the tracking and the line spacing and all that kind of stuff to really customize this however I want. In the final version, I changed the color to red, add a little bit of optical glow, and I also used the CC lens effect to kind of create this kind of like distortion. So again, it's not the biggest deal in the world, and I'm not going to spend much time on it, but it just adds a nice little bit of complexity. I mean, this is actual code being typed out, and it looks like I spent a lot more time on this than I did. So I love that effect. Now, let's go over to reflection. This is, again, one of my favorite parts of this whole thing, and I didn't think so. Let me just make a reflection. It sounds boring and stupid, but I had a blast doing this. Now, typically when you make a reflection, you know, like a lot of common thing to do is just kind of like duplicate the layer, and then like, you know, you could right click and transform on it and flip vertical, and then like you reposition it and scale it or whatever. But there's a lot of problems with that. Number one, because it's a separate layer, it's a duplicate, you're not having this kind of like procedural thing. So if you change something on the source layer, it's not going to show up in the duplicated reflection. So that's a problem. And then also, it doesn't take into consideration what it's being reflected on. So this background, for example, is pretty complex. There's a lot going on. We could obviously mask this out and do that on our reflection. It's a lot of work, but it can be done. But the thing is if the background plate evolves and changes over time, then that's going to be potentially a lot of extra work to do. So isn't there a better way? And yes, there is a better way. And the answer is to use the reflection plugin, which is in the VFX Suite by Red Giant. So I want to apply that. And when we applies that, we create the plane of reflection by the left and right points here. Let me zoom out so you can see the whole deal. And then we have the height and slant here. Now, this is really cool. I think this is super, super great. And it's really cool to be able to pick the axis of reflection and the angle that this is reflecting at, and to be able to like stretch it out organically, or have it come from a different angle, or whatever we want to do. And there are, of course, fade parameters if we wanted to like fade the top of this, which is almost always a good idea. So there's a lot of really cool options here. But semi-recently, they added one that just blew my mind and I find coming in handy all the time, and it just really saved my life in this instance. And that's the ability to use a displacement map. So what I did is I made a copy, as you can see here by this gigantic all caps reflection map. And I went in and I, did some levels and curves fiddling and threshold and whatever. And I got the map looking like I wanted, so I could kind of white out the parts where I didn't want the reflection to be. And then I can go to my reflection, and in displacement map from the drop down here, I will choose reflection map, and I will also make sure to choose not just source, but effects and masks. I want to see all of the levels and curves and threshold and all that junk that I did. And nothing shows up initially, but what I need to do is change the horizontal or vertical displacement. So I'll take this up to a very modest, like, 7 or something. And now look at that. It's using that reflection map based on the plate as a reflection map to determine like where the reflection is going to be applied or not applied. And so all this fine detail, these little tiny baby islands in here, it's respecting all of that stuff. And imagine doing all that work of showing this here, like where to reflect and where not to reflect. That's so tedious. And because it's built off of the main plate, if the plate were to evolve, if there were a drop of water in the plate, then the reflection displacement map is going to pick that up. It's a completely flexible way to work. I could smooth this out a little bit, maybe add just like just a little bit of smoothness around those edges there, and we have this great reflection. Or do we? Because what happens is when I preview this, it looks amazing, obviously, but it's not tracked to our plate. It's kind of just like floating willy-nilly. How are we going to do that, folks? How are we going to track this reflection into our footage? Especially because we need 3 points tracked. How many trackers do you know that have 3 points that I can say I want this point to track and that point to track and that point to track? Well, what I ended up doing, and I've never done this before, so it was a learning experience for me. I love this. But what I ended up doing was going to the Kingpin Tracker effect, which is a planar tracker also in the VFX Suite. And then the Kingpin Tracker, it gives you 4 points to track with. As you can see here, these 4 points. And then what I did is I went to reflection and I copied the axis start and put that on the left pin here, the axis end, put that on the right pin here, and the slant and height pin, and put that here, and then just put this 4th pin some other place where it made kind of like a plane. And then I tracked the footage using Kingpin Tracker, just click play. It tracked my footage automatically here, as you can see, in rock solid track. And then I just linked up upper left, upper right, and lower left, these 3 points, with those points from reflection. So then we have a perfectly tracked reflection, a procedural, perfectly tracked reflection. And if I were to go through and add anything else to this guru, or if the background plate were to change in some way, all of it's set up to be procedural, so the reflection will be updated and tracked with the footage. And that's fantastic. Okay, last thing we need to do is bring all of this magic together and make it look like it belongs in the same scene. This is not like a really tall order in terms of compositing, but it does showcase a really cool feature. So if I go to Supercomp here, the Supercomp composition, and I'm going to go ahead and turn off the kingpin tracker. Again, we have a cool scene here. This looks good. It's just lacking a lot of pop and pizzazz. And anytime you're trying to do visual effects and compositing in a layer-based compositor like After Effects, you're going to have some issues because the layers don't talk to each other. The bottom layer, like this background plate, can't really talk to the top layer in a dynamic way. And that's why Supercomp is so important, is it allows you to have effects that will speak to each other and break the layer order. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the reflection. And oh, by the way, what I did too is I separated the hologram guru guy into two different pieces. The bottom, which is like form, and then the top, which is just like him. I think I showed you something a little bit similar to that before. I also have like the text layers. So I'm going to select all of these and the base layer, basically all the things that I want to bring into Supercomp to kind of like merge together. So with all these things selected, I'm going to go to the effect menu and go to RG VFX and choose Supercomp. So then we have this cool window that pops up, this little sandbox that allows us to blend layers together in ways that After Effects just can't. So one of the things I want to do is I want to select some of these layers that are supposed to kind of be glowy layers. And I'm going to change the layer type from normal to additive. This just kind of changes the way that Supercomp sees these layers, and they blend like they would in the add or screen blend mode. So I'm going to do that to the bottom, the masked bottom, and I'm going to change the text layers to the same thing, additive layers. So they kind of add in the background, pop a little bit more. So far, not anything impressive yet. I realize that. Stay with me, folks. But here's the magic. And I'm going to show you a few things in Supercomp, but really this is all you need to know. I'm going to go down to this background layer, and I'm going to apply an optical glow. And you might be saying, if you're not familiar with Supercomp, so what? I can apply optical glow at any point, just like apply it as a standalone effect onto the footage. Big whoop, who cares? But when you apply it in Supercomp, look at the side of the guru's face when we apply this glow. Okay, so I'm going to apply this optical glow, and it's going to be like a little over the top at first. So I'm going to take the amount down to 8% and leave everything else as it is. But notice here what's happening. I'll turn the effect on and off with this little blue switch here. The glow is glowing over the top of our guru's face and the hat along, over these edges. And that is the magic of Supercomp. That might seem like a small thing, but that's why the effect is called optical glow. Because with optics, when you're actually filming with the camera, if there was a bright background, that light would bounce into the lens and create this bloom in front of, it would seem to be in front of, whatever you are filming. But After Effects can't do that by itself. It can't jump the layer order to apply a glow. But we can do this here, and we have this glow on the side of our kid's head, which is really cool. Likewise, we could also go into our masked bottom, and apply optical glow here. By the way, you might be wondering, what's the difference between layer glow and optical glow? Well, optical glow works like glow does optically, where glows can be in front of an object. But layer glow isolates the glow to the layer. So they seem like they're the exact same. It can be confusing, but layer glow isolates the glow to the layer. Optical glow allows it to work like optical glows do in the real world, which is where there's no front or behind, it's just whatever is hitting the lens. So I'm going to choose optical glow with this masked bottom, and then we get this like beautiful effect here. And I say beautiful, we need to scale it down, of course. Again, take it down to like 8, and maybe even take the size up a little bit to like 50. And so we have this like really cool glow. And I want a similar glow for the reflection. So I can just right click, choose copy, and on the reflection layer, right click and choose paste effects. Now, some other things I did, I went to the mask top layer here, and I added some additional light wrap to kind of enhance this look. And then I also went into an adjustment layer, which I put on top, and just to kind of, bring the contrast down and tie it all together. But this is the final result. And, it's fun and goofy and silly, but, I learned a lot about how these tools work along the way, and it was fantastic. Another little tip is that Supercomp doesn't do well with 3D layers. So you'll notice that all of the things that I sent to Supercomp were pre-compositions. And that is important because I needed that tracked camera data to make sure that everything still kind of like fit together in the scene. So what I had to do is make copies of the camera and put that into all the pre-comps. So all the pre-comps were working, and then send the pre-comps to Supercomp, which again, you have to do if you're working with 3D. So this is the final result here. What a blast. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you had a good time and learned quite a few things about the amazing Red Giant toolset here. Again, I'm Chad Perkins, and thanks for watching. Take care.